For centuries, the Vikings have been remembered as fearless warriors who lived and died with honor, seeking eternal glory in the halls of Valhalla. Popular culture has painted them as noble seafarers, courageous explorers, and even democratic heroes who valued freedom and equality. Television shows, novels, and video games have romanticized their image, presenting them as larger-than-life figures who embodied strength, adventure, and an unbreakable code of honor. But what if this image is only half the story, or perhaps a carefully crafted myth meant to hide a much darker reality? What if the Vikings, instead of being brave warriors bound by honor, were in fact ruthless pirates of the North, men whose lives were defined not by courage but by brutality, greed, and terror? To begin understanding this contrast, we must first look at how the myth of Viking bravery was constructed. Much of what we think we know about the Vikings comes from sagas written centuries after the Viking Age had ended. These sagas, preserved by later Christian scribes in Iceland, combined real events with myth, embellishment, and political bias. They elevated certain individuals to the level of legendary heroes, portraying them as mighty warriors who laughed in the face of death. Skaldic poetry, with its kennings and glorified language, reinforced the idea that dying in battle was noble and desirable. To be remembered in verse was to live forever. Yet even as these stories circulated, contemporary accounts from the people who actually encountered Vikings told a very different story. Monks in England, Francia, and Ireland described the Norsemen not as noble warriors but as demons from the sea. Their chronicles are filled with horror. Monasteries burned to the ground, churches desecrated, holy relics stolen, and entire villages enslaved. In the year 793, when Vikings attacked the monastery at Lindisfarne, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded it as a great terror. They wrote that serpents were seen in the sky, lightning struck churches, and famine followed, signs of divine anger. The Vikings were not praised as brave opponents. They were cursed as scourges sent by God to punish the people. Such accounts remind us that the reality of Viking raids was often indiscriminate violence. Unlike warriors in organized armies, who fought battles against armed opponents, Vikings frequently targeted the defenseless. Monasteries, with their treasure and unarmed monks, were favorite victims. Villages without fortifications were easy prey. They struck suddenly from the sea, using their longships for speed and surprise, and disappeared before local defenses could gather. This was not the behavior of brave soldiers seeking fair combat. It was the strategy of pirates, exploiting weakness for plunder. Their bravery, if we can even call it that, was tied less to facing worthy enemies and more to embracing brutality without hesitation. But why has the myth of bravery survived while the reality of piracy has been overshadowed? One reason is that later generations, especially Scandinavian nationalists in the 19th century, sought to reclaim the Viking past as a source of pride. To them, portraying the Norse as ruthless pirates was shameful, while presenting them as explorers, traders, and brave warriors was honorable. Romantic nationalism turned raiders into adventurers, pirates into pioneers, and plunder into glory. Another reason is that violence itself was rebranded as courage. To face death without fear was indeed remarkable, but it did not erase the fact that much of Viking violence was directed against those who could not fight back. It is one thing to die bravely in a shield wall. It is another to slaughter monks and enslave children. Yet by glorifying the former, the sagas conveniently ignored the latter. Historians who dig into the archaeological evidence paint a grim picture that supports the darker view. Mass graves of captives show signs of execution. Human remains found near raiding sites reveal brutal killings, sometimes with skulls split open from behind, suggesting victims were struck down while fleeing, not while fighting. Hoards of treasure buried in Scandinavia contain church relics and sacred objects looted from monasteries, testifying that holy sites were stripped not out of bravery but out of greed. The Viking economy itself depended heavily on raiding and the slave trade. Archaeological finds in Dublin, York, and Hedeby reveal bustling slave markets where men, women, and children were sold. Slavery was not incidental, it was central. Every raid that seized captives fed this system. For the victims, the Vikings were not brave warriors. They were ruthless kidnappers and pirates whose ships brought terror wherever they appeared on the horizon. To call them warriors is to sanitize the horror they inflicted. Their longships were engines of piracy, their axes tools of plunder, their courage indistinguishable from cruelty. Yet we must not dismiss their skill. They were exceptional sailors, capable of navigating rivers and open seas with equal ease. Their raids were highly organized, their weapons deadly, their tactics effective. But skill does not equal nobility, and organization does not equal honor. Pirates can be skilled without being brave in the heroic sense. Courage in the Viking world was often a mask for savagery. They may have laughed at death, but they also laughed as they burned villages and carried women into slavery. For the people who suffered under their raids, there was no glory in being their victim. Thus, to peel back the layers of myth, we must ask, were the Vikings brave, or were they brutal? The answer lies in understanding that bravery and piracy are not opposites but can exist together. The Vikings were brave in the sense that they faced hardship and danger without fear. But bravery alone does not make one noble. When bravery is harnessed to plunder, enslavement, and terror, it ceases to be admirable and becomes frightening. In truth, the Vikings were both courageous and cruel, but history has too often remembered only the courage and forgotten the cruelty. Our task is to restore balance, to remember that their pact with the gods, if it existed, was sealed not only with heroic deeds but also with ruthless acts of piracy. The image of the Viking as a fearless warrior often begins with the famous raid on Lindisfarne in 793, an event so shocking that it echoed through the chronicles of Europe as a nightmare without precedent. To later storytellers, it became proof of Viking courage, a daring strike on a sacred site. But to those who lived through it, and to the monks who recorded it, the raid was not bravery. It was terror, piracy, and sacrilege. Lindisfarne was a monastery on the coast of Northumbria, a place of prayer, learning, and devotion. Its monks lived in peace, surrounded by relics, manuscripts, and the treasures of their faith. They had no army, no walls, no weapons. When the Viking longships appeared on the horizon, slicing through the waves with their dragon-headed prows, the monks could do nothing but pray. What followed was slaughter. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded it as a great harrowing, with heathen men desecrating the holy place, carrying off treasures, killing some of the brothers, enslaving others, and leaving the rest to mourn. There was no honor in this act. It was not a clash between warriors. It was the plunder of the defenseless. And it was only the beginning. In the decades that followed, Viking raids spread like wildfire across Europe. They struck monasteries, villages, and towns, always choosing weak points, always seeking profit. They used their longships to bypass fortified ports and strike deep inland. Rivers once thought impassable became highways for terror. The Seine, the Loire, the Thames, all carried fleets of raiders into the heartlands of kingdoms. Paris, Rouen, Nantes, Hamburg, Dorstad, none were safe. Again and again, they looted, burned, and vanished before defenses could gather. The brilliance of the longship made them mobile, but mobility was not nobility. It was the perfect tool for piracy. These raids were not random acts of violence but part of a calculated system. The Vikings sought wealth above all else: gold, silver, cattle, and, most importantly, slaves. Every raid produced captives, men to be sold as laborers, women and children to be sold or kept as concubines. The slave markets of Dublin and York grew fat on this trade. To the victims, Viking bravery was indistinguishable from cruelty. Families were torn apart, communities destroyed, entire generations condemned to bondage. The Viking economy thrived not on honor but on human misery. Yet the myth persisted. Sagas told of raids as great feats of courage. Warriors were praised for their daring, their fearlessness, their laughter in the face of danger. But who was the danger? Monks with no swords? Villagers with no walls? Traders with no guards? Bravery was redefined to mean mercilessness. To strike at the weak and call it courage was the Viking way. Archaeology confirms this grim truth. Mass graves near raid sites show signs of brutal killings. Skulls split from behind, bodies dumped without ceremony, children among the dead. Hoards of treasure found in Scandinavia contain reliquaries and chalices from churches, sacred objects stripped of meaning and melted down for wealth. Viking art, too, reflects this obsession with plunder. Dragons, wolves, and serpents adorn their carvings, symbols not of peace but of destruction. To call them noble warriors is to ignore the evidence of blood and fire. The fear they inspired was legendary. In Francia, peasants prayed from the fury of the Northmen, "O Lord, deliver us." In England, kings scrambled to build defenses, fortifying towns and rivers. Yet the Vikings adapted, striking where defenses were weakest, demanding tribute when resistance was too strong. This tribute, known as Danegeld, was another form of piracy, payment to be spared. Kings who could not defeat them had to buy them off. Far from courageous warriors, the Vikings became extortionists, shaking down entire kingdoms for silver. The Chronicle of St. Bertin records how Charles the Bald paid thousands of pounds of silver to keep the Northmen from Paris, only for them to return the next year with greater demands. This was not bravery but blackmail. And yet, within Viking culture, this piracy was celebrated. To return home with wealth, slaves, and treasure was proof of success. Songs were sung, stories told, heroes praised. Courage was measured not by who you fought but by how much you stole. It is this inversion of values that confuses modern audiences. We see the daring, but we forget the victims. We hear the sagas, but we silence the chronicles. The Vikings' own myth has triumphed over the truth. But history remembers. The monks at Lindisfarne, the peasants along the Seine, the captives in Dublin, all bore witness to the reality. For them, the Vikings were not noble warriors but ruthless pirates of the north. The first wave of terror set the pattern for centuries. From the coasts of Britain to the rivers of Germany, from the monasteries of Ireland to the markets of Byzantium, Viking piracy reshaped Europe. They were not bound by honor but by hunger for wealth. They were not guided by courage but by calculation. Their bravery was real, but it was the bravery of wolves, not knights. It was the courage to kill, plunder, and enslave without hesitation. The myth of noble warriors would come later, polished by sagas, romanticized by nationalists, and retold in modern media. But beneath the myth lies the forgotten truth. The Vikings were pirates, and their age was an age of terror. If there is one element of Viking society that destroys the myth of noble warriors more completely than any other, it is slavery. To call them raiders is accurate, but to understand the full scale of their brutality, we must recognize that the Vikings were not only pirates but also slavers whose entire economy was deeply dependent on human trafficking. The sagas glorify battles and feasts, yet behind those feasts were slaves preparing the food, tending the animals, and working the fields. Behind every voyage of discovery was a system of bondage that reduced countless men, women, and children into commodities. To their victims, the Vikings were not heroic fighters but predators who stole human lives. Archaeological finds in Dublin, once the largest Viking settlement in Ireland, reveal slave markets that traded thousands each year. Slaves, or thralls as the Norse called them, were captured in raids and sold for silver, goods, or services. They came from everywhere the longships reached. England, Scotland, Ireland, Francia, the Baltic lands, even as far south as Spain. Captives were stripped of their names, their families, and their freedom. Many were worked to death, while others were sold again in faraway markets. Some ended up in the households of Viking chieftains, forced into labor, concubinage, or sacrifice. This trade was not incidental. It was essential. Without slavery, Viking society could not have functioned. Thralls worked the land so that free men could raid. They built ships, tended herds, and performed the menial labor that sustained communities. Wealthy Vikings measured their power not just by silver or land but by how many thralls they owned. The bravery of raiders was built on the backs of slaves. Contemporary accounts confirm this reality. The Arab traveler Ibn Fadlan described Vikings along the Volga with brutal honesty. He admired their strength but condemned their filth and cruelty. He wrote of women treated as chattel, sold and resold, their lives worth no more than cattle. He witnessed ritual sacrifices where slaves were killed to accompany their masters into death, as if their humanity was disposable. To Ibn Fadlan, there was no nobility in this, only barbarity. Adam of Bremen, the German chronicler, told similar stories of mass sacrifices and human bondage in Viking lands. To him, the Norse were not brave but bloodthirsty. Yet sagas conveniently avoided such depictions, focusing instead on the glory of raiding and the supposed honor of dying in battle. The myth was carefully constructed to hide the foundation of slavery. Archaeology again reveals the truth. Graves of Viking women sometimes contain multiple slave burials, suggesting that thralls were killed to serve their mistresses in the afterlife. At Trelleborg in Denmark, remains show evidence of slaves buried with ropes still around their necks. At other sites, mass graves hold men, women, and children who were clearly not honored but discarded. This was the dark underside of Viking power. And yet, in modern imagination, we see Vikings as adventurers, explorers of new lands. Rarely do we imagine the countless captives chained in their ships, packed like cargo, bound for markets where their fate was decided by the highest bidder. This was not bravery, it was piracy at its most ruthless. To raid was to feed the slave system. To plunder was to acquire wealth not just in silver but in flesh. The Vikings turned human suffering into profit. This system also explains the frequency of raids. Treasure alone was not enough. Silver could be spent, goods consumed, but slaves reproduced wealth daily through their labor. Each raid replenished the workforce of Viking society. Each raid ensured new victims to replace the old. This cycle was endless, sustained by violence. In this light, the claim that Vikings sought glory collapses. They sought profit, and they did so through one of the cruelest trades in human history. Modern romanticism about their bravery cannot erase the cries of those taken, the lives broken, the families torn apart. We cannot speak of Viking courage without speaking of Viking slavery. To call them warriors is to give them too much honor. They were pirates, kidnappers, and traffickers. Their longships were prisons, their raids human hunts. Even their supposed courage in facing death must be questioned. Was it bravery? Or was it the recklessness of men who profited so much from violence that they could not imagine life otherwise? When we strip away the myth, what remains is not a heroic people but a brutal economy. The Viking Age was not just an age of exploration, it was an age of slavery, blood, and piracy. This truth must stand alongside the stories of Valhalla and honor. The pact the Vikings made was not only with their gods but with cruelty itself. And in that pact, countless innocents paid the price. The true power of the Vikings did not come from their swords alone, but from the culture of fear they cultivated across Europe. Fear was their greatest weapon, one that struck long before their ships appeared on the horizon. The mere rumor of Viking sails could empty a town, scatter peasants into the woods, and paralyze kings into inaction. To understand why they succeeded for centuries, we must understand how they deliberately crafted and exploited terror as part of their piracy. Monasteries and towns were not just raided for wealth. They were raided to send a message. When the Vikings struck Lindisfarne, the brutality was remembered for generations. Victims were slaughtered without mercy, survivors were enslaved, and the sacred was defiled. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded signs in the heavens: storms, lightning, serpents. As if even God himself was horrified. This memory became legend, and legend became fear. Every time a Viking raid was whispered, people recalled Lindisfarne and trembled. The Vikings understood this psychology. By being unpredictable, they magnified terror. One year they struck the English coast, the next year the rivers of Francia, the next the monasteries of Ireland. Defenses could never be everywhere at once. A kingdom might fortify its coast, only for Vikings to appear deep inland. The longship was the perfect instrument of fear, slipping silently up rivers and appearing suddenly in the heart of a city. The defenders never knew where or when the next attack would come. This unpredictability made resistance seem futile. Fear also spread through spectacle. The Vikings did not hide their cruelty. They displayed it. Victims were hung in sacred groves. Villages were burned to the ground, and captives were paraded as trophies. Tales of their violence spread faster than their ships, carried by terrified refugees and horrified chroniclers. To peasants, the Norsemen were not men at all but monsters, wolves in human form, sent from hell itself. In Francia, prayers were written into the liturgy. From the fury of the Northmen, O Lord, deliver us. Imagine the impact of hearing such words in church week after week, year after year. Even worship acknowledged Viking terror. This was psychological warfare centuries before the term existed. Tribute payments, known as Danegeld, were another tool of fear. The Vikings demanded silver not just to enrich themselves but to demonstrate their dominance. Kings who paid bought temporary safety but admitted weakness. Each payment emboldened the raiders and spread despair among the people. Charles the Bald of West Francia paid enormous sums, yet the Vikings returned again and again. The message was clear. Resistance was useless, fear was wise. Even the Vikings' appearance fueled terror. They cultivated an image of savagery, wearing animal skins, carving grotesque designs into their ships, and wielding axes that split shields and skulls alike. Berserkers, warriors who fought in a frenzy, were especially terrifying. Covered in blood, howling like beasts, they seemed more demon than man. Whether drugged, enraged, or possessed, they spread panic before they even struck. Fear was contagious. Entire armies fled at the sight of berserkers charging without shields or armor, their madness making them seem invincible. Archaeological and written evidence supports this culture of fear. The Chronicle of St. Bertrand describes how entire towns fled before Viking fleets. At Hamburg in 845, Ragnar's fleet of 120 ships sailed up the Elbe, captured the city, and demanded ransom. The archbishop fled, the churches were looted, and the city lay in ruins. This was not courage. It was piracy magnified by terror. The same tactics repeated across Europe. At Paris in 885, Vikings besieged the city for nearly a year, terrorizing the countryside and forcing defenders to live in constant fear. Even when defeated, they returned, relentless as waves. It was this relentlessness that deepened fear. People knew the Vikings could not be permanently stopped, only delayed. The result was despair, a kind of surrender before the battle even began. Stories of torture also contributed. While not all accounts can be trusted, the infamous Blood Eagle execution, where a victim's ribs were cut and lungs pulled out, was whispered across Europe. Whether or not it was common practice, the terror of the idea alone was powerful. The Vikings understood that cruelty did not need to be universal. It only needed to be believed. Fear is remembered longer than kindness. While later sagas glamorized this terror as strength, to the victims it was piracy perfected. The Vikings' weaponized reputation, turning brutality into strategy. Every burned monastery, every enslaved village, every mutilated body was part of the message. Resist us and suffer. Even when kings began to fortify their lands, fear remained. Fortresses could be built, armies raised, but people still remembered. Trauma lingered across generations. The Vikings' age of piracy lasted not just because of their ships or their axes, but because they mastered psychological dominance. They thrived on the weakness of others, and fear created weakness where none existed. This culture of fear also shaped Viking identity. Within their society, tales of terror became sources of pride. To strike terror in enemies was proof of strength. Children were raised on stories of raids where entire towns fled. Courage was redefined not as facing equal foes but as terrifying them into submission. Fear was not an unfortunate side effect of piracy. It was the goal. Modern retellings often emphasize Viking exploration, Greenland, Vinland, the rivers of Russia. Yet even these voyages were shadowed by piracy. The same men who discovered new lands also raided existing ones. Their courage cannot be separated from their cruelty, and their discoveries cannot erase their terror. In the end, the Vikings' legacy is a paradox. They are remembered as brave warriors, yet their power came from making others afraid to fight back. They are praised as fearless, yet they relied on the fear of the defenseless. Their bravery was real but twisted, bravery in cruelty, courage in piracy. And fear was their truest weapon, a weapon sharper than any axe, more devastating than any raid. When we strip away the romanticism that later ages layered onto Viking history, we see that piracy was not only an economic engine but also a political weapon. The Vikings were not states in the modern sense. They were loose networks of chieftains, jarls, and warbands bound together by ambition, kinship, and opportunity. Within this framework, piracy was a form of politics, a way to build power, gain followers, and control territory. Raiding was not a chaotic outbreak of violence but a deliberate tool of authority. A Viking leader proved himself not by issuing laws or maintaining peace but by leading successful raids. Wealth taken abroad, silver, gold, slaves, was redistributed at home to secure loyalty. In this sense, piracy was governance, a brutal but effective form of politics where loyalty was purchased through plunder. A chieftain who failed to raid or who returned empty-handed risked losing followers. In a world without fixed states, the ship and the sword were the instruments of legitimacy. Contemporary chronicles, often horrified, describe these leaders with both fear and contempt. Frankish sources speak of men like Ragnar, who terrorized Paris and extracted ransom, not because he wanted to rule but because extortion gave him power. His fleets were not armies of conquest but machines of blackmail. They struck, demanded tribute, and left. Yet even this form of piracy shaped politics in Francia. Kings who could not repel the Norse paid Danegeld, acknowledging Viking dominance. Each payment weakened royal prestige and strengthened the myth of Viking invincibility. Piracy thus reshaped the politics of entire kingdoms. Archaeology reveals that the wealth funneled back to Scandinavia through piracy created new centers of power. Burials of elite Vikings contain not only weapons but foreign silver, Islamic coins from as far as the Abbasid Caliphate, and artifacts from Byzantium. These objects were more than trophies. They were political tools. They demonstrated that a leader could provide wealth and adventure, binding men to his service. In this way, piracy built hierarchy within Viking society. At the same time, it created instability abroad. Francia, England, and Ireland all fractured under the strain of constant raiding. Local lords built their own defenses, fortified towns, and raised armies. Kings who failed to protect their people lost legitimacy, while Viking leaders gained it through terror. In this way, piracy was a mirror. Viking power rose as European kingship faltered. The Danegeld system illustrates this perfectly. When Charles the Bald paid the Vikings to leave Paris, he sent silver by the cartload. The Norse left, only to return later. To his people, he seemed weak. To the Vikings, he seemed profitable. Each transaction was a political statement. The crown could not defend its lands without buying off the pirates. The Viking leaders understood this and exploited it. They did not need to conquer kingdoms. They only needed to humiliate kings. In England, a similar pattern emerged. Monasteries and towns paid tribute to avoid destruction. Alfred the Great of Wessex eventually turned the tide by building fortified boroughs and organizing a navy. But until then, the Vikings held the upper hand. Their raids weakened rivals and shifted power balances. Piracy was thus not aimless violence but deliberate political maneuvering. Within Viking society, the politics of piracy also played out internally. Chieftains competed with each other, and the only way to surpass rivals was through greater raids. A leader who captured more treasure attracted more men, which in turn allowed larger raids, which attracted still more followers. This feedback loop meant that piracy escalated constantly, driving expansion further and further. It was not bravery that drove them into distant lands but the political necessity of outshining rivals. The sagas preserve echoes of this competition. Heroes are praised for the size of their fleets, the daring of their raids, and the wealth they returned with. Rarely are they praised for governance or justice. Politics was piracy, and piracy was politics. Even when Vikings began to settle, their piracy continued to shape their rule. In Ireland, Viking towns like Dublin were founded on slave markets. In England, Norse settlers demanded tribute from surrounding regions. In Francia, Viking chieftains became dukes, their power rooted in their ability to extract wealth by force. The very structures of Viking polities grew from piracy. The transition from raiding bands to rulers did not erase piracy but institutionalized it. Rulers who once demanded silver as ransom now demanded it as tax. The line between pirate and prince was thin, blurred by the constant flow of plunder. The romantic image of noble Viking warriors obscures this reality. They were not knights bound by chivalry. They were warlords bound by plunder. Their politics was not about justice or order but about maintaining dominance through fear and wealth. Piracy was their constitution, their parliament, their diplomacy. Even treaties with European kings were shaped by piracy. Agreements often promised peace only if tribute was paid, effectively legalizing extortion. When payments stopped, raids resumed. The Vikings operated as states of piracy, mobile and relentless, negotiating from positions of terror. The culture of fear they spread was not only psychological but political. Kings weakened by raids faced rebellion at home. People who lost faith in their rulers sometimes turned to the Vikings themselves, seeking protection or profit. Piracy destabilized kingdoms and expanded Viking influence. It was a form of shadow politics, undermining crowns without claiming them. This was their genius. They ruled without ruling, controlled without occupying, extracted without governing. Later sagas would reinterpret this as proof of Viking boldness, but the truth is simpler and darker. The Vikings were pirates who turned their piracy into politics. They manipulated fear, wealth, and violence to build power both at home and abroad. Their ships were their thrones, their swords their laws, their plunder their taxes. Bravery was not the key to their success, calculated piracy was. In the end, the politics of piracy left scars across Europe. Kings learned to build stronger states in response, while Viking leaders turned from raiding to ruling. But we must remember the foundation. It was not noble war that built Viking power but ruthless piracy, carefully wielded as politics. That is the reality behind the myth of bravery. If the Vikings were truly ruthless pirates, then how did they come to be remembered as brave warriors, almost noble figures of legend? The answer lies in the power of myth, the stories told not by their victims but by their descendants and later admirers. Over time, the raw terror of Viking raids was transformed into tales of adventure, exploration, and courage. The mask of myth concealed the blood and chains of reality. This transformation began with the sagas, written centuries after the Viking Age by Icelandic authors who were themselves Christians living in a very different world. These sagas blended history with legend, elevating pirates into heroes. Raids that devastated towns were retold as glorious expeditions. Chieftains who demanded tribute became kings in all but name. Acts of terror were described as feats of bravery. In the sagas, Vikings laughed at death, defied gods, and fought giants. The violence was still there, but it was recast as noble rather than cruel. Oral poetry played a similar role. Skalds praised their patrons, turning brutal raids into songs of honor. A chieftain who enslaved hundreds would be praised for his daring. A warrior who burned a monastery would be remembered for his fearlessness. By shaping memory through verse, the Vikings themselves began constructing the mask of myth. To their own people, they were not pirates but champions. Archaeological evidence tells us another side of the story. Treasure hoards buried in Scandinavia often include church objects, reliquaries, and sacred items stolen from monasteries. To the victims, these were desecrations. To the Vikings, they became symbols of wealth and power, woven into their mythology of success. Objects stolen through piracy were later displayed as trophies of courage. In this way, plunder became proof of bravery. Later centuries deepened the mask. During the 19th century, as nationalism swept across Europe, Scandinavian countries sought proud origins. The Vikings were recast as founders of democracy, explorers of distant lands, and paragons of courage. Their piracy was softened into seafaring, their slavery forgotten, their raids reframed as heroic adventures. Writers, artists, and historians elevated them to near-mythic status, making them symbols of identity rather than terror. Even in Britain and France, once victims of Viking raids, the image shifted. By then, the descendants of the Norse had become rulers of Normandy and England. To vilify the Vikings was to vilify ancestors of kings. Thus, the pirates were remembered not as criminals but as conquerors. History was rewritten by the victors, and the mask of myth grew thicker. Modern media has continued this process. Films, television, and video games present Vikings as fearless warriors, larger than life, fighting with honor. Rarely do we see the slave chains, the terrified monks, the burning villages. Audiences prefer the myth of glory over the reality of piracy. It sells better, inspires more, and flatters national pride. Yet the truth remains. Beneath the mask of myth lies the evidence of cruelty. Chronicles from monks describe horror, not admiration. Archaeology reveals brutality, not honor. Accounts from outsiders like Ibn Fadlan portray filth and savagery, not nobility. The contrast between myth and reality is stark. Why, then, does the mask persist? Because myth is more powerful than truth when it serves identity. For Scandinavians, remembering Vikings as pirates is shameful. Remembering them as heroes is inspiring. For modern audiences, tales of bravery entertain, tales of slavery disturb. The myth gives us a story we want, the reality a story we avoid. But to understand the Vikings honestly, we must tear away the mask. When we do, the pirates reappear. Their bravery was not the bravery of knights but of wolves. Fearless because they preyed on the weak. Their courage was not noble but ruthless, a tool for piracy rather than honor. The mask of myth may shine brightly, but the darkness beneath it has not gone away. Recognizing this does not mean denying Viking skill. They were extraordinary sailors, cunning tacticians, and relentless fighters. But skill is not nobility, and ferocity is not honor. We can admire their abilities while condemning their cruelty. To confuse the two is to accept the mask without question. The Vikings wore their mask even in their own time. To their victims they were demons. To their followers they were heroes. A single raid could be remembered in two completely different ways, depending on who told the story. Over time, only the heroic version survived. History favored the raiders, not the raided. And so the pirates of the North became brave warriors in memory. But we, with the evidence before us, can see both sides. The sagas tell us of glory. The chronicles tell us of terror. The artifacts tell us of plunder. The graves tell us of slaughter. The truth is not in one or the other but in both, and when balanced, the picture is clear. The Vikings were not what the myths claim. They were ruthless pirates who used bravery as a mask, cruelty as a tool, and fear as their greatest weapon. To understand why the Vikings were able to terrorize so much of Europe, we must look not only at their myths and politics but at the machinery of war that made their piracy possible. The most famous of these tools was the longship, a vessel so advanced in design that it allowed the Norse to project power far beyond the reach of other peoples of their time. Long, narrow, and flexible, the longship could travel both on the open sea and up shallow rivers. It was powered by both sail and oars, giving it speed and adaptability. A fleet of longships could appear suddenly on a coast or glide silently up a river, bypassing defenses and striking at the heart of towns and monasteries. This technological advantage is often cited as proof of Viking brilliance, and indeed it was. But we must remember what this brilliance served. Not exploration alone, but piracy. These ships were not built primarily to discover new lands or engage in fair battles. They were built to raid, to strike, and to vanish. Their design made terror possible, and terror was the Vikings' greatest strategy. Archaeological finds confirm the sophistication of the longship. The Oseberg ship, buried in Norway, demonstrates the craftsmanship of Viking shipbuilders, with its carved prows and sleek lines. Other ship burials, like Gokstad, reveal vessels capable of carrying large crews and heavy plunder. To their people, these ships were symbols of prestige. To their victims, they were harbingers of death. Imagine standing on a riverbank and seeing dragon-headed ships gliding toward you, oars flashing, filled with armed men. The sight alone was enough to inspire panic. The Vikings understood this psychological power and enhanced it with decoration. Their ships were often painted and carved to look monstrous, embodying the wolves and dragons of their mythology. The machinery of war extended beyond ships. Viking weapons were simple but effective. Axes, swords, spears, and bows. The axe became iconic not only because it was deadly but because it was versatile. A tool for chopping wood could become a weapon for splitting skulls. Swords, rarer and more expensive, were prized possessions often given names and passed down generations. Archaeology has uncovered swords inscribed with Ulfbert, blades of superior steel forged with techniques that astonished contemporaries. These weapons, combined with the ferocity of their users, gave the Vikings tactical superiority in many encounters. Yet again, this superiority was not used for noble warfare but for piracy. They did not seek battles of honor but raids of opportunity. Their machinery of war was optimized not for set-piece clashes but for sudden strikes. The shield wall, their main battlefield tactic, was simple but effective. Warriors interlocked shields, forming a barrier against arrows and enemy charges. This tactic allowed them to hold their ground against larger forces, especially when combined with the ferocity of berserkers who broke enemy morale. Berserkers, perhaps enhanced by rituals, drugs, or psychological conditioning, charged into battle with animalistic rage, howling and biting their shields. Their presence magnified terror, convincing enemies that the Vikings were possessed by dark powers. Again, this was not bravery in the knightly sense but intimidation used as a weapon. Fear was always part of the machinery of war. Archaeological evidence of armor and helmets reveals that while some Vikings wore mail, many fought with little protection. This has been romanticized as proof of their courage. In reality, it was often necessity. Armor was expensive. What looked like fearlessness was sometimes poverty. Yet even this was turned into advantage. Lightly armored men moved quickly, raided swiftly, and withdrew before heavy forces could respond. Their lack of protection reinforced their reputation as men who did not fear death, whether or not that was true. Horses were also part of the machinery, though less emphasized. Some raids involved mounted warriors, increasing mobility inland. Combined with ships, this allowed Vikings to strike deep and fast. The combination of longships, axes, swords, berserkers, and speed created a system of piracy more efficient than any before it. But efficiency does not equal nobility. The machinery of war, like the politics of piracy, was dedicated to exploitation. To build ships so advanced, to forge weapons so deadly, and to master tactics so effective, all of this speaks to skill. Yet skill without honor is piracy perfected. Their victims remembered not the craftsmanship of ships but the fire that consumed their towns. They remembered not the forging of swords but the blood those swords spilled. They remembered not the tactic of the shield wall but the chains that bound their children. The machinery of war made piracy possible, and piracy made the Vikings feared. The sagas would later celebrate these tools as signs of bravery, but the chronicles remind us what they really were: instruments of terror. When we strip away the romance, we see clearly. The Vikings' brilliance lay not in building civilizations but in perfecting the technology of destruction. Their ships were not caravels of discovery but engines of plunder. Their weapons were not knightly swords of honor but tools of extortion. Their tactics were not designed for fair fights but for overwhelming the unprepared. The machinery of war reveals the truth. The Vikings were not noble warriors but ruthless pirates, and every ship they launched, every axe they raised, every shield they locked was another cog in the machinery of piracy. For nearly a century, Europe seemed helpless before the fury of the Vikings. Towns were burned, monasteries looted, and kings humiliated into paying tribute. Yet eventually the tide began to turn. The very fear that had once paralyzed kingdoms now spurred them to adapt, organize, and resist. This counteroffensive reveals much about the Vikings' true nature. Brave warriors invite battles. Pirates flee when confronted with strength. The decline of Viking dominance was not the result of diminished courage but of Europe learning to fight piracy with structure. The first step in striking back came through fortification. In England, Alfred the Great recognized that the Vikings thrived on mobility and surprise. To counter this, he built a network of fortified towns, known as buzz, strategically placed across Wessex. These buzz provided refuge for local populations and bases for counterattacks. Suddenly, Viking raids were no longer guaranteed success. To plunder, they had to besiege fortresses, something their hit-and-run tactics were not designed to do. The machinery of piracy faltered when confronted with walls. At the same time, Alfred reorganized his army and built a navy to challenge Viking fleets directly. His reforms allowed Wessex not only to resist but to push back, eventually leading to the reconquest of lands overrun by Norse invaders. Alfred's success proves the point. Once Europe adapted, the myth of Viking invincibility collapsed. Francia too learned to resist. Initially humiliated by paying Danegeld, the Franks began building bridges across rivers to block longships and establishing permanent garrisons. When Viking fleets sailed up the Seine in later years, they found obstacles that neutralized their mobility. Charles the Bald and his successors turned piracy into a less profitable venture by denying easy access to inland riches. Some Vikings, recognizing this, shifted from raiding to settlement, as in Normandy. Yet even this settlement reveals the truth. Pirates became rulers not by conquering in fair battle but by being offered land in exchange for peace. Rollo, the Viking leader who founded Normandy, did not win his duchy through honor. He extorted it through terror, forcing the Frankish king to legitimize piracy by transforming it into lordship. Normandy itself was a monument to extortion. Resistance was not only military but cultural. The spread of Christianity hardened communities against Norse raids. Monasteries fortified themselves, churches became rallying points, and prayers turned into organized militias. The same faith that Vikings once mocked became a shield. By the 10th century, Europe was no longer a collection of easy prey but a patchwork of fortified, organized states. Viking raids became riskier, less profitable, and increasingly desperate. Archaeology supports this shift. Early Viking hordes in Scandinavia overflow with silver from raiding. Later hordes are smaller, reflecting the decline of piracy as resistance grew. Slave markets in Dublin and York shrank as captives became harder to obtain. The economy of piracy began to crumble under pressure. To mask this decline, sagas later exaggerated Viking bravery, turning defeats into victories and humiliations into heroic struggles. But contemporary chronicles tell us the truth. When faced with strong opposition, the Vikings often retreated or negotiated. At Paris in 885, after a year-long siege, they accepted payment to leave rather than win by force. At Chartres in 911, they were decisively beaten. These moments expose the reality. Pirates excel when fear dominates. When resistance grows, their power fades. The shift from raiding to settlement also underscores their pragmatic, not noble, nature. Vikings who once burned villages now farmed them, marrying locals and adopting customs. Their transformation was not born of honor but necessity. Piracy no longer paid. Survival demanded assimilation. Brave warriors fight for ideals. Pirates adapt for profit. This distinction matters. The myth of the Viking warrior endures because it celebrates courage, but history shows us adaptation and retreat. The Norse did not fight to the last man. They bargained, extorted, and surrendered when it suited them. This is not dishonor, it is piracy. To survive, pirates changed their tactics. And the Vikings did exactly that. Europe's strike back reshaped the continent. The buzz of Alfred laid the foundation for England's unity. The concessions to Rollo created Normandy, which centuries later would launch William the Conqueror against England. In resisting the Vikings, Europe became stronger, more centralized, more prepared. Ironically, the age of piracy contributed to the birth of stronger states. Yet the Vikings themselves lost their dominance. By the late 10th century, their raids dwindled. New powers, like the kingdoms of England and Francia, were too strong. Piracy could no longer sustain Norse society. The final raids, like those of Sweyn Forkbeard and Nut, resembled invasions and conquests more than hit-and-run piracy. The age of raiding gave way to the age of kingship. The myth of the Viking warrior was born in this twilight, when Norse leaders sought legitimacy not through piracy but through rule. To justify their authority, they cloaked their past in bravery. But the chronicles remain, reminding us that what they truly wielded was not honor but terror. Europe's resistance proved the point most clearly. The Vikings were never invincible. They thrived only when fear reigned. Once courage and organization returned to their enemies, the pirates of the north were exposed. Their ships could burn, their armies could be beaten, their leaders could be bribed or broken. The culture of fear collapsed when Europe struck back. And when it collapsed, so too did the illusion of noble warriors. What remained were ruthless pirates, remembered in sagas as heroes but revealed in truth as opportunists. When the Viking Age faded, the memory of the Northmen did not disappear. Instead, it transformed. For the victims, their legacy was one of scars, burned towns, lost families, and decades of terror. For their descendants, their legacy became a matter of pride, reframed into tales of courage and exploration. Between these two poles lies the truth. The Vikings' most enduring legacy was their ruthlessness, an inheritance that shaped Europe and still colors our imagination today. To understand this legacy, we must start with the immediate aftermath of their raids. In England, monasteries rebuilt, but many never regained their treasures. Libraries of manuscripts were destroyed, irreplaceable knowledge lost. In Francia, towns fortified their rivers, building bridges and walls that would shape the architecture of medieval Europe. In Ireland, Viking settlements like Dublin reshaped the economy, turning once rural lands into hubs of commerce and slavery. Everywhere they went, the Vikings left structural changes behind, often born of necessity. Communities learned to defend themselves not out of admiration but out of trauma. This ruthlessness also left a cultural legacy in memory. Chroniclers did not write of noble warriors but of wolves, demons, and scourges. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the Annals of Ulster, the Chronicle of St. Bertin, all record the Vikings as terrors, not heroes. Their names became synonymous with fear. For generations, parents frightened children with tales of the Northmen. In these records, the legacy of piracy outweighed the myth of bravery. Yet within Scandinavia, the story changed. Sagas elevated raiders into heroes. Skalds sang of their exploits, minimizing the slavery and maximizing the glory. Leaders whose power rested on piracy were remembered as kings of conquest. This dual legacy, terror abroad, glory at home, created a paradox that still persists. The ruthlessness was real, but the myth made it bearable. Archaeology reminds us that the material legacy was built on brutality. Silver hoards buried in Sweden and Denmark are filled with coins from the Abbasid Caliphate, Byzantine treasures, and Christian relics, evidence of far-flung piracy and plunder. Mass graves reveal captives executed, slaves sacrificed, children buried without care. These finds confirm what chronicles described. Ruthlessness was not exception but norm. Even the Viking economy itself was shaped by it. Slavery remained a cornerstone until Christianity gradually eroded the practice. But for centuries, thralls were as much a legacy as ships or swords. That is why the Viking Age cannot be understood without acknowledging its brutality. Later nationalists tried to rewrite this legacy. In the 19th century, during waves of Romanticism, Scandinavians embraced the Vikings as symbols of freedom and strength. Writers compared them to ancient Greeks, explorers of spirit as much as of land. Piracy was rebranded as trade, slavery ignored, terror forgotten. The myth of bravery triumphed over the memory of ruthlessness. Yet this rewriting itself reveals the persistence of their legacy. The very need to transform pirates into heroes shows how uncomfortable the truth remained. Ruthlessness could not inspire nations. Bravery could. But beneath the myth, the scars of their piracy still shaped Europe. Fortifications, military reforms, and centralized states all emerged in response to Viking terror. England's buzz, Francia's bridges, Ireland's fortified towns. All were monuments to their ruthlessness. Their legacy was not honor but the necessity of resistance. In modern culture, the legacy continues to oscillate. Television shows portray Vikings as rugged warriors bound by fate. Museums highlight their ships and art while softening their brutality. Video games let us play as fearless Norse raiders without showing the slave chains that followed them. The myth is seductive, but the truth lingers. Scholars continue to dig, uncovering graves, translating chronicles, reminding us of the darker legacy. The fascination with Vikings today, our obsession with their bravery, is itself part of their legacy. They succeeded in creating fear so powerful that even centuries later, we mistake it for awe. The mask of myth has lasted because ruthlessness, when retold, can look like courage. Yet we must ask, is terror a form of bravery, or merely cruelty perfected? The legacy of ruthlessness forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. We cannot deny their skill, but we must not confuse skill with nobility. We cannot deny their courage, but we must recognize it was often courage in plunder, not injustice. Their ships, weapons, and tactics were brilliant, but their purpose was piracy. Their legacy is not only the spread of Norse culture but the scars left on those they enslaved, robbed, and burned. To ignore this is to accept the myth without question. The Vikings' ruthlessness shaped not only the medieval world but also our modern imagination. They are remembered because they terrified. They are admired because their terror has been repackaged as bravery. But when we strip away the mask, what remains is clear. The Vikings were not noble warriors but ruthless pirates, and that ruthlessness is their truest legacy. The Viking Age has long fascinated historians, storytellers, and audiences alike. It is easy to see why. Longships cutting through the mist, warriors roaring into battle, sagas of gods and heroes shaping destiny. For centuries, we have embraced the myth of the Viking as a fearless warrior, bound by honor, striving for eternal glory. Yet the evidence we have explored tells a different story. The chronicles of their victims, the archaeology of their graves, and the legacy of their actions all reveal that the Vikings were not noble fighters but ruthless pirates, whose courage was wielded in the service of plunder, slavery, and terror. To call them warriors is to grant them a dignity they rarely earned. They were opportunists, extortionists, and traffickers who preyed upon the weak more often than they fought equals. Their longships, while technological marvels, were designed for raiding, not exploration alone. Their weapons, though deadly, were turned against monks, villagers, and captives more than against armies. Their bravery, so celebrated in sagas, was often the courage to burn churches, enslave children, and demand silver as ransom. The myth of noble warriors collapses when measured against the weight of evidence. Consider again Lindisfarne in 793, remembered as the dawn of the Viking Age. To later admirers, it was a daring strike. To those who were there, it was piracy at its worst. Defenseless monks cut down, holy relics stolen, a sanctuary desecrated. This pattern repeated across Europe for centuries. Towns burned, kingdoms paid Danegeld, families were torn apart. Such acts are not the deeds of knights but of pirates. The Viking economy itself was built on slavery. Thralls were captured in raids, sold in markets from Dublin to Hedeby, and forced into lives of labor or concubinage. Archaeology uncovers their graves, their bones marked by violence, their names erased. This was not incidental. It was systemic. Without slavery, Norse society would have faltered. This alone shatters the illusion of nobility. Warriors fight for ideals. Pirates traffic in human flesh. Even when faced with resistance, the Vikings revealed their pragmatism rather than their supposed bravery. They extorted kings with threats, accepted payments to retreat, and shifted to settlement when raids grew too dangerous. Rollo did not win Normandy through glorious conquest. He received it in exchange for peace. Sweyn Forkbeard and Nut transformed piracy into kingship, institutionalizing extortion as taxation. These were not the actions of noble warriors but of pragmatic pirates. They thrived on fear, and when fear was met with resistance, they adapted. The myth of the fearless warrior obscures the truth of the calculating raider. And yet, the myth has power. It persisted because it was useful. To the Vikings themselves, sagas turned terror into glory, giving meaning to brutality. To later nationalists, the myth offered pride and identity. To modern audiences, it provides drama and entertainment. But myths are not facts. We must distinguish between the mask of legend and the face of history. The face we see is ruthless, scarred, and bloody. That does not mean the Vikings were without skill or impact. Their seamanship was unmatched. Their raids reshaped kingdoms, and their legacy influenced Europe profoundly. But skill without honor is piracy, and impact without justice is terror. The Vikings left behind fortifications, centralized states, and even cultural exchanges. But they also left scars, scars borne by the enslaved, the burned, and the broken. To celebrate them only as brave warriors is to silence their victims. The truer legacy is more complex and far darker. They were pirates of the North, and their age was an age of fear. Even today, the fascination persists. We watch television shows and see heroes. We play games and command longships. We visit museums and marvel at artifacts. Yet behind every ship lies the memory of raids. Behind every sword, the blood of innocence. Behind every saga, the silence of those who could not speak. If we wish to honor history, we must tell it honestly. The Vikings were ruthless pirates, not noble warriors. Their bravery was real but misdirected. Their courage undeniable but cruel. They laughed at death, yes, but they also laughed as they enslaved, extorted, and destroyed. Their legend shines bright, but their truth is darker. To remember only the shine is to betray the past. To see the darkness is to understand it. And understanding is the first step toward truth. In the end, we can admire their skill without glorifying their cruelty. We can study their ships, their art, their mythology, while still acknowledging the terror they inflicted. We can recognize the myth while holding onto the reality. The Vikings will always be remembered, but let us remember them not only as heroes of sagas but as pirates of history. Their story is a reminder that bravery alone does not make nobility, that courage and cruelty is still cruelty, and that myths, no matter how seductive, must never blind us to truth. The Northmen sought eternal glory, but what they achieved was eternal fear. And perhaps that is their most honest legacy.